1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. My name is Andreas Werner. I'm a record producer, songwriter, and owner of Crazy Chester Records. The Crazy Chester Radio Hour is a weekly music talk podcast where I get to interview the musicians, songwriters, producers, and engineers who created some of my favorite records, many of them in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. But best of all, I also count them all as my friends. Today, I'm very thrilled to have David Hood as my guest. David Hood is the bass player of the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section, also known as the Swampers, and one of the 4 owners of the Muscle Shoals Sound studios. I've been fortunate to work with David in the recording studio, but also on selected shows with the Muscle Shoals All-Stars at places like Lincoln Center in New York and the Pareto Soul Festival in Italy. Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, David. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks for being my guest. Let me start in the beginning. What are some of your earliest musical memories?
I always loved music, and my father was a music fan and played the radio and his 78 RPM records quite a bit. And so he liked big band music. He liked the Mills Brothers. He liked the classical music. And so my interests are varied from early age, and also at the church we went to here in Sheffield, First Presbyterian Church. The music there influenced me. There was an organist there who was really good, and I would kind of just drift away listening to that music when I was supposed to be listening to the Word of God, I guess. But music has always taken me places, and I took piano lessons very unsuccessfully in the 5th grade. I just didn't want to stay inside and practice. And later, I wanted to be in the high school band, and usually when you get in the band, you start in junior high school. And for some reason or another, I didn't sign up in junior high school to do it. So when I've been a late starter my whole life so far, and when I finally got into the high school band, I took private lessons from the band director for about a year, and got in the 10th grade, which is behind everyone else. But and of course they wanted to treat me like a freshman or something and make me go through the belt line and all that kind of stuff that you're not supposed to do anymore. But I wasn't having it since I was already a sophomore. And I played trombone in the school band and really loved it. Especially the concert band part where you didn't march, but you just played music. And I really enjoyed that, and I think a lot of that has carried over into my career today, and playing with other people in a band ensemble situation. The trombone plays a supportive role quite a bit, and I adapted that to the bass guitar. I started playing the bass. I think I first saw my first bass probably when I was about 15 years old, which is pretty late for most musicians, but I never even knew what one was. I was watching bands play at what we call the Naval Reserve, which is the second location of Muscle Shoals Sound, big building like a armory, except it was for the Navy. And people would rent that on weekends and have bands play. And I would go watch Hollis Dixon and the Keynotes and the Del Reys, which was Jimmy Johnson's band, and the Mark V, which was Jerry Kerrigan, David Briggs, and Norbert Putnam, and Marlon Green. I'd go watch these bands, and here I'd be one of those kids that stood up front watching the players. And I kept hearing doom, 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 doom. And I thought, what's making that noise? Because I'd see what I thought were two guitars. And I finally figured out that one of the guitars was bigger, and it was a bass guitar. And thinking that I was 15 years old before I ever knew what one was, is pretty wild, because I bought one at age 18 and started playing, and by age 22 or 23 I'd played on a gold record, which is kind of wild. I started late but then went fast, I guess. But that's my beginnings, I guess you could say. I always loved music and wanted to be part of it, but it took me a while to find where I should be.
Yeah, and even prior, you got hired to play trombone on a few sessions, I guess, including I'm Your Puppet by Purifies and Never Loved a Man by
Yes.
Aretha.
Yeah, at that time I was playing the bass guitar or whatever I could play just to get on a recording session, because I liked recording rather than playing live right from the beginning. And it was the band I had played in, the Mystics with Terry Woodford. We had a run of about 4 years, but then everybody was graduating from college and getting regular jobs. And I was not graduating from college, and I already had a regular job because I was working at a tire store for my father. I wanted to continue playing but stay in town, and recording was the way to do it. So I started hanging around Fame, and I would shake a tambourine or play the bass or play the trombone or anything they'd let me do to be part of the early recording scene around here.
Yeah, and Terry Woodford and the Mystics did 45 called I Could Cry and Where Is My Little Girl. Was that one of your earliest recording sessions?
Yeah, Where's My Little Girl? Terry's father paid the money to go in the studio and record that, and we hired Rick at Fame and went in and cut Where's My Little Girl, and I forgot what the other side was, but it might have been I Could Cry. But Where's My Little Girl was a regional hit, and we used that to get gigs for probably 2 or 3 years locally, and it was on the charts a little bit around here. It was a really, really bubblegum sounding thing. And what was funny on it is the guy who played drums normally with the band played guitar on that song because he knew how to finger pick, and it had was a finger picking part, and so he played the drums. And Larry Hamby, who was our regular guitar player, he played the guitar on that, and Larry Hamby, who was our regular guitar player, played drums when he'd do that. And while we were doing all that, I would get on the shoulders of Terry Woodford, and that was about it. We didn't do any somersaults, but that was our bit of showmanship, switching off instruments and getting on somebody's shoulders. And that's what got me to this point today, is riding on somebody's shoulders. But it was a pretty good record, but very, very bubblegum sounding, Where's My Little Girl?
What were you listening to when you started out playing bass? Is there anybody in particular?
Well, I liked rhythm and blues music right from the start, and I was listening to Jimmy Reed and Ray Charles and Bo Diddley and a lot of the R&B artists, even though I didn't really know they were R&B. The reason for this, we had a radio station here, WLAY AM, and they played everything. And they'd play a country song, then they'd play a rhythm and blues song, then they'd play a pop song, and like that all day. And so my influences were really varied. I was listening to everything, but my favorites usually ran toward the rhythm and blues music. But WLAY was a big influence in my career early on, and I think it was for a lot of the musicians around here because they played everything and not just one style of music.
Yeah. So when you started getting called to do sessions playing the bass, were some of the other musicians, mainly Jimmy Johnson, Roger Hawkins, and Spooner Oldham, Junior Lowe, who were part of the players who were part of the rhythm section when you got some of your earliest
When
gigs?
I first started playing, Junior had been playing bass. He switched to guitar. Spooner was playing keys at that time. Roger, of course, was playing drums, and Jimmy was either rhythm guitar or sound engineer on a lot of the things we did. Later, Eddie Hinton moved to town. I think this was about 1966. And not long after that, Spooner wanted to move to Memphis to follow. Dan Penn had been writing with Spooner quite a bit, and Dan moved to Memphis, so Spooner decided he was going to move to Memphis. And we started our search at Fame for a keyboard player to replace Spooner. And we tried Marvell Thomas, who is Rufus's son, and we tried a couple of other players, and then we tried Barry Beckett. And Barry seemed like the one who would, the one that fit in the best for one thing, but also he was willing to move here. He was originally from Birmingham, but had been living in Pensacola, Florida. But we talked him into moving here, and under the condition that he would learn to play more black style of music, because that's what we were doing at Fame at that time. We were playing a lot of rhythm and blues, and we felt that Barry needed to learn how to play more rhythm and blues style piano, so he did. And I had to do the same thing. After Warm and Tender Love, which was Percy Sledge's follow-up to When a Man Loves a Woman, I started getting calls because that was a gold record. And I thought, well, gosh, I'm going to have to learn how to play other than the things I'd been playing. So I bought a bunch of Stax and Motown records, and I would sit and I would listen to the bass parts that Duck or James Jamerson were playing, and got a lot of my style from what they were doing, because I really didn't know what to play before that. I knew I played in bands, but I didn't know what a chorus was or what a bridge was or a verse. And I had to learn that you played one thing for one part and another thing for another part. And so that was my music, I guess, lessons, was listening to James Jamerson and Duck Dunn and a few other rhythm and blues players.
Yeah, you mentioned Percy Sledge, and a lot of Percy stuff was recorded at Queen Ivy's studio.
Right.
So you worked over there a lot too?
Yes, in the beginning of my career, I was doing a lot of hanging around. Like I said, I'd play trombone or bass or whatever they need, either free or very inexpensively for whoever. And when they called and wanted me to play on Warm and Tender Love, or the follow-up to When a Man Loves a Woman, I was really surprised because Junior had played that. And I thought, well, why not use him again? But I think Junior was wanting to switch to guitar, and for some reason, Marlon Green and Quinn Ivy, who were Percy's producers, called me to be on that session. And it was kind of coincidental. It was the last night, May 14th, I think, was the last night that the Mystics played, and then I recorded with them May 15th, 1966. So it's like I went from one thing to the other just overnight. And of course, when the record came out and it was a hit, and it would have been because of being a follow-up to When a Man Loves a Woman, I was getting calls to play, and so I really had to get on it to learn how to play with because Roger and Jimmy and the rest of them were a little bit further down the road than I in my musical development.
Yeah. And so over the next few years, you guys were very prolific over at Fame.
Yeah, and at Quinn Ivy's studio. We did a lot of work at both places, and even would go to Nashville some and record. We were really busy. When I look on my diaries and see what we were doing, we recorded quite a bit.
Yeah, and then a lot. I believe you told me that one of the reasons that you guys eventually moved on from Fame was because of all the different places you were able to work, and I guess the situation Rick wanted to have you work exclusively for him at Fame.
Yes, he was starting a new label with Capitol Records, and he wanted to make the rhythm section exclusive to Fame. And at that time, we were working with all kinds of people and really having fun working with the different kinds of music and things. And that would have limited us to just working with him. We liked working with Rick, but it was just we didn't want to not be able to do the other stuff. We were happy working with Rick. It's just when we told him that we weren't going to be part of his exclusive deal, it sort of ended our deal. And that's when we were able to borrow the money and buy what is now, or what would become Muscle Shoals Sound. It was already a studio. It was Beavis' studio. A fellow named Fred Beavis put it together. It was a 4-track studio, and Fred soon learned that he really didn't know what to do with the studio, and so he would approach Jimmy and Roger about buying it. Jimmy and Roger knew that they needed to have a complete rhythm section in order to make it work, and so they approached Barry and I, and so we became studio owners. And we, in our original agreement, we said, all right, if people want to record with us, they're going to have to come record at our studio. And that was, I think, a good thing for us. And I think it was really a good thing for Muscle Shoals in general, because that meant there were 2 or 3 studios working instead of just one. And it was a great thing for us to move and go out on our own. And I don't think it really hurt Rick as much as he thought it did, because he was producer of the year the next year. So he continued on.
Yeah, and besides your individual talents as musicians, what did each of the 4 of you contribute to Muscle Shoals Sound? What were your jobs?
Yeah, we shared the owning a business. It was bigger than we had realized, but Jimmy was more or less, since he had experience running a studio with Rick, Jimmy was I guess you'd say, the studio manager. Barry was going to be the head of our production company that we were starting, and Roger and I were just the Indians, I guess. I later took over the booking of the studio, and we knew early on that we were going to need a publishing company, because we saw there was a potential to get songs recorded. All the people that were coming into the studio, nearly everyone needs a song. And so thanks to Jimmy Johnson's experience at Fame in the publishing business, we formed our publishing company, and we would hire writers to come and write songs for some of the artists that we were working with. And that was really how we got in business, I guess, one of the ways. In order to borrow the money from Atlantic Records to start our studio, we agreed to give them half of our publishing. So each thing helped the next thing, and like we couldn't have done it without the help of Atlantic Records. But we paid Atlantic Records back, not only in paying the note. We worked cheap for them, cheaply as musicians. We gave them a good deal on studio time, and we gave them half of our publishing, which sounded like a pretty good deal to me for them. And it was okay for us because it got us started.
Yeah. So besides the 4 of you, who were you mentioned the songwriters, who were some of the other kind of people who completed the puzzle there early on?
Yeah, well, we knew early on that we would need, Jimmy didn't want to be the engineer. He wanted to be the rhythm guitar player. And so we got Marlon Green to be the head engineer at our studio. Eddie Hinton was in town by that time, so we got Eddie to be our first lead guitar player. And we soon, after a little bit, started finding people to run our publishing company. Diane Butler later ran our publishing company, and Carol Little, later Carol Buckins, was our main, office person. I hate to say secretary because she did so much more than that, but she ran our studio as far as the keeping the books and all that, and Diane Butler ran the publishing company, and we had other musicians that would help us too. Sooner or later, Clayton Ivey was one who played extra keyboards. Later, Randy McCormick came in and he played. It has always been more than just the four of us. We always needed other people to help us, and they all played a big role in our success.
Yeah, and for many years, you told me that you pretty much did an album a week. You were very prolific during that time.
Yeah, we tried to stay booked up as much as we could, and we made it a. I mean, we had to put our studio survival right at the top of everything, even over wives and family and stuff like that. Anytime that we had something booked, we were there, and a lot of times it was back to back. We'd have 4 or 5 days with one artist, and then another 4 or 5 days with another artist, and then on and on and on for quite a while. And we'd after a while we realized we need to take a little time off every now and then. So we'd take a week off at Christmas and a week or so off in the summertime, just to kind of maintain the studio for one thing, but also for our heads.
Yeah, and a lot of people obviously know about Paul Simon and Bob Seger and all the big names. And I would like to mention a few records too that might not be necessarily the greatest hits, but are certainly some of my favorites. But before I do that, I can't get around asking you about the Staple Singers, because the B Altitude album is probably my favorite album of all time.
It's one of my favorites, and it was kind of I think we've had a great amount of luck in things. When after we started working, Atlantic was our biggest client, and we really depended on Atlantic for our business. After a while, Jerry Wexler and Tom Dowd and some of the Atlantic people had been recording quite a bit at Criteria in studio in Miami, and they had homes down there, and so they wanted us to move down there and be the rhythm section down there. Well, by that time we had been at our studio on Jackson Highway maybe a couple years. We didn't want to leave, so when we told Atlantic that we didn't want to move to Miami, they started cutting their artists other places. And right after that, Booker T and the MGs decided they didn't want to be the house band at Stax. And so all of a sudden we started getting the rhythm section work from Stax. And so Atlantic pulls out, Stax moves in. And pretty soon we were booking back-to-back with Stax artists. And Mavis and Johnny Taylor and some of the other Stax artists we were recording with. And they brought the Staple Singers in. Stax had recorded one album with them, and it wasn't really a great album. It was Duck and Al Jackson and Cropper and all of them playing on it, but you could tell their minds were on something else a little bit. It wasn't a very successful album, so Al Bell decided he was going to bring the Staples here and try to go for a more pop-friendly version of the Staple Singers. The first album we cut was the one that had Heavy Makes You Happy on it, and it was a pretty good hit, but when they came back to record The Altitude, I think all the pieces fell together. It had just enough pop influence, but still kept the rhythm and blues influence, and the Staple Singers were always going to have that great gospel feel. So it was just the perfect situation, I think, and it was one of my favorite albums as well. A really good album. The Staples early on would not do any kind of lover cheating kind of song or any kind of dark material. They always wanted uplifting stuff, and that's the basic basis of The Altitude, which is defined by Be High. or on yourself. And they did Respect Yourself and I'll Take You There. They did all these uplifting songs. And it's a great album. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, and another Stax hit that was cut here that I guess not that many people know about is Luther Ingram's If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right.
Yeah.
That had Pete Carr playing some excellent guitar on it.
That was a great record, and we were really on a roll with the Staple Singers and the Stax artists at that time. And Stax had a man who worked with them named Johnny Baylor, and he was, I guess you could describe as an enforcer. He was I think had some black gangster type background. And Stax hired him to come in and collect money for them from people who would not pay and things like that. And he worked his way in. Pretty soon he was producing records with them. And Luther Ingram was the artist that he brought down. And Johnny Baylor and some of his cohorts came in with Luther. And I think they must have thought they had to intimidate us to cut a hit record, because they came in and just more or less threatened us that, well, we're going to cut a hit record here. And we were going to cut a hit record anyway, as best we could. But it was kind of a funny scene. One of the guys was a ex-prize fighter, and he dropped down on the floor in the studio and started doing one-arm push-ups and just looking at each one of us, trying to intimidate us. And that was not necessary, because we were going to do the best we could anyway. But we all, I guess, instead of being intimidated, were kind of amused by that. But we did cut a great record. That If Loving You Is Wrong is, I guess, the biggest hit that Luther ever had. And it was a really big record. I still hear it quite a bit on stations that play that kind of music. And it was remarkable. The guitar in it was great. There were a lot of really good parts to that record that just came off the top of our head. We were really on a roll. As much as we could, we were the producers on those records, even though Johnny Baylor would tell you otherwise.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier I'd love to talk a little bit more about certain records that might have not been the biggest hits, but they're, in my opinion, some of the best. And I know one of them, we shared the opinion, and certainly Jimmy Johnson, it's one of his favorites, and that's when Aretha Franklin came down to cut an instrumental album.
Right.
It came out as Glass Onion, and that had You on it, that had the Sweet Inspirations on it, I believe.
Eddie Hinton.
Eddie Hinton, King Curtis's horns.
Yeah, it was a great record. When we first started working with Atlantic, after we got Muscle Shoals Sound, the first artist for Atlantic was Cher, and the producers on that were Jerry Wexler and Tom Dowd and Aretha Franklin. And Aretha would come back and produce some other people, and he had the idea that Aretha was a great arranger as well as a producer, and he got the idea that he wanted to cut this instrumental album, recording songs that were popular at that time. And so that was Glass Onion, which is a Beatles tune off I believe, the White Album. And we cut a couple of Rolling Stones records, songs, and some other things. It's an instrumental album mostly, with some vocal, not really lead vocal, but vocal on it. And it was a really good record. I don't know if it was a hit. I don't think it was a hit, but it was something I was very proud of. And Eddie Hinton did some great guitar on it, but he also did some weird vocal sounds on it. I believe on Sympathy for the Devil, he did all these kind of sounds. It was a fun record.
Yeah, and another one I love is King Curtis did an album called Get Ready, and it's all of you plus Cornell Dupree played on it too.
Right.
And it's an instrumental album. And you even got some songwriting credits on it as well.
Yeah, I wasn't used. I don't know if any of us were really used to doing that kind of thing, but King Curtis would come down and he'd have a rhythm section, and of course he could play. He was a wonderful saxophone player, but he would have no songs. So we would just sit in the studio and start recording stuff, not necessarily like a jam, but we'd come up with an idea for a groove of some sort, and then he'd come back and put his sax on it, and he did bring Cornell, and Cornell came several times, I think, but with King Curtis, he was in King's band, and I still get royalties from that, from my songwriting, which I really didn't do very much songwriting. We would just come up with bass lines and things, and King would play the saxophone on it. But we would share the songwriting credits. So I think Barry's the songwriter on a couple songs, and I am on another one, and Roger is on another one, and Jimmy is on another one, sort of like that. And I still get like 50 cents every now and then for that in the mail.
Yeah. Somebody else that came down and did quite a huge project with you was Leon Russell and Danny Cordell for Shelter Records. How did that connection come about?
I'm not really sure how it came about. We had worked with Denny Cordell on several things. Denny Cordell was an Irishman. I guess his stardom, if he has any stardom, came from writing Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum. But he was a producer. He and Chris Blackwell worked quite a bit together. But he became a partner with Leon Russell for Shelter Records in Tulsa, and they were at first looking for places to record. And I'm not really sure who got them to come here. It might have been Marlon Green. I don't know where the first connection was, but Denny is really the one who named us the Swampers. He put on one of the Leon Russell records, he had the Tulsa band on part of the record, and then he had us on the other part of the record, and he called us the Muscle Shoals Swampers. And that was what the Leonard Skinner guys heard, and that's when they decided to put that in Sweet Home, Alabama. So we didn't intend to be the Swampers, but we became the Swampers. We were always the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section officially, but Swampers is a good one.
Yeah. So you mainly worked in the studio all those years, but then in the early 70s, Traffic came to Muscle Shoals Sound to record, and they recruited you to join them on the road too. How did that come about?
Well, we had been recording with Jimmy Cliff for Chris Blackwell, and when they would bring Jimmy Cliff here, this was pre-Bob Marley or any of the reggae period, they would bring Jimmy Cliff here, and they would try to get us to make him more like American soul singer. In other words, take some of the Jamaica out of him, which I thought was crazy because he was a great songwriter and all his grooves were really good. We loved working with Jimmy Cliff. But during this time, Traffic had recorded, and we'd also been working with Jim Capaldi, who was one of the key members of Traffic. Traffic had recorded Low Spark of High Heel Boys, but they were having problems with Rick Gretsch and Jim Gordon, who were the rhythm section, bass player and drummer in Traffic at that time. I think a little substance abuse and just different things. It was getting where they couldn't really work with them anymore, so they needed a rhythm section, and they had heard our work with Jimmy Cliff and heard the work that we had done with Jim Capaldi and thought, well, we might be a good fit to go out and promote the Low Spark album. So they came to us, and we rehearsed, I think, 2, maybe 3 days, the Low Spark stuff and a bunch of other Traffic stuff, and then hit the road. And the first night we played was at the Yale Fieldhouse in New Jersey. Where is Yale? Wherever New Haven, Connecticut. Anyway, we played there, and we were downstairs waiting to go on stage. We had not yet played with Traffic. I had a little chord charts on a tiny piece of paper, and we were trying to remember these songs, which were kind of strange songs for us. But we were downstairs in the dressing room, and we hear this big roar of the crowd. So I go up the steps and look out, and the crowd is packed in that place, and they're cheering the Frisbee. And none of us had ever even seen a concert like this. It was a huge rock concert, but we go up on stage and start playing, and I realized I can't see my chord charts because of the lighting on stage. It was chaotic for the first several songs, and we at our first break they play Rainmaker, and it's a song that was just Chris Wood, Jim Capaldi, Steve Winwood, and Rebop, and no bass and drums on it. So Roger and I get off the stage. Roger does not want to go back on stage because he's just about freaked out. But they do. We do go back on stage, and we eventually get where we can play with Traffic. But at first, it was really hard for a band used to recording 3 and 4 minute songs in the studio to play with something like that. It was so loud, and it was so just everything was different. It was very hard for us to go from the studio situation to do that, but we got it. Probably after a week or so, we were doing pretty good, and so they agreed to the next year to come and record Shootout at the Fantasy Factory with us, and we did another American tour and another European tour and a tour of Great Britain, and it all worked pretty good with them. But after that, I think the powers that be, probably Steve Winwood, thought it was too big. I've read reviews from that time, and everybody in the reviews said it was the best that Traffic ever sounded. And it was really good, but it was big because by that time we had Barry switching off on organ and piano, and when Winwood was playing guitar, and and then Roger was playing drums, Capaldi was playing drums. It was crazy. I mean, having 2 sets of drums and all this stuff, it really got big and much bigger than what Traffic originally intended to be. So we parted ways after that. They kept being Traffic, and we kept being the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section.
Yeah. So is the very first tour, was that just you and Roger?
Yeah, the first tour was just Roger and I, and Jimmy went to do front of house sound. And Barry went to California and just did sessions out there. And the way we got them to pay us that first time is we got them to rent the studio, paying our studio time so we could pay our salaries for our staff. And our pay, as far as musicians, was based sort of like session musician pay, and it wasn't nearly enough. We didn't realize that because we had no idea what kind of money those people made, but I was told later that they paid for us in like the first 2 nights for the whole month tour. But the next year we got paid more realistically, I think. It was a great experience too, because I had never really traveled like that around the country or around in Europe, and I'd never seen big concerts like that. So it kind of gave us the other side of the story. We were always working in the studio, and we didn't know what people did with the music after it left us. And that kind of gave us, all right, so that's what they do with it when they leave.
Yeah. So we talked about the session playing, but at Muscle Shoals Sound, I guess towards the second half of the 70s especially, you started producing some records. You did the Perkins Smith album by yourself, and then with Jimmy you did a couple Jackson Highway albums, a couple Blackfoot albums, and a really cool album, and I know I share that opinion with your son Patterson. That's the Maggie and Terry Roach album, Seductive Reasoning.
Yes.
Was that a natural progression for you?
Well, I wasn't really interested in being a producer that much, but Barry was starting to produce, and Roger was producing a little bit with Jimmy, and then later on Roger and Barry were producing. It was like everybody was pushing me to produce, and I was still trying to learn how to play the bass. Hadn't really thought about producing, but they coaxed me into doing it. So Smith, Perkins Smith was my second attempt at production. I did something called the Great American Middle Class with vocalist Laura Struzik and another guy whose name I have unfortunately forgotten. But it was pretty good, and I thought, well, gosh, I think I can do this. So the Smith, Perkins Smith thing, it was Steve Smith and
Tim
Smith they were writers for our publishing company, and we saw the songs were pretty good, but were missing something. And they at the time had been writing with a guy named Charles Feldman, who now works for BMI
Up in New York.
up in New
Yeah, I know
York. But
Charlie.
Charlie was a songwriter, but not really cut out to be a rock and roller. And so he dropped out of the group, and they brought in Wayne Perkins to be the guitar player. So it became Smith, Perkins, Smith. And it was kind of a tough situation. It was a really real learning experience for me because I was having to deal with two brothers who had gigantic egos and had sibling rivalry. And Wayne was a very gifted guitar player, but wasn't really ready to settle down and focus on the studio that much. But I had delusions of becoming George Martin working on that. I worked so hard on it. I lived that album for about a year or more, trying to get it together. And finally it did come out. Island Records took it up. And the first thing they did was take Smith, Perkins, Smith to England and start cutting another album with them. So that kind of shut me out of that loop there working with them. But they the same problems I had with them, they continued to have, and the group broke up not too long after that. But it was a learning experience, as was working with Jimmy on Blackfoot and later Jackson Highway. Jimmy was my teacher, and I really had less input as a producer on that because Jimmy was such a good producer. I would just sort of stand there and nod and would let the band do whatever they did. But the Roach sisters, Maggie and Terry Roach, Paul had been teaching a class at a university in New York, and Maggie and Terry went to the songwriting class, and Paul saw that they had some talent and tried to he put them on one of his songs that we had recorded, and then he started producing a song with them. And he spent, I think, most of his budget, so he wanted to finish what would be the album on them, and he brought them to Jimmy and I. I think Jimmy saw pretty soon that it was not something that he really cared for a whole lot. They were another couple of siblings that were hard to work with, and somehow I ended up with the whole project. But it was really good. I enjoyed working with them, and Maggie unfortunately just passed away this past year, but I still stay in touch with Terry Roach. I'm proud of the work that I did with them. It was I think some good stuff. They were great artists. It was kind of the wrong time for them as well. I think when we finished the record and put it out, then they decided they didn't want to do that anymore. And so again, something I worked so hard on was just sort of dropped by the wayside. And I think ultimately that made me decide, well, I'm not sure I want to be a producer.
Yeah. Towards the end of the 70s, you guys partnered with Capitol Records and had Muscle Shoals Sound Records. Was that Capitol approaching you, or how did that come about?
We were working with a manager of some of the artists we worked with, whose name escapes me right now, and he would probably shoot me if he knew that. But he was pushing for us to get a record label together, and he somehow found the deal with Capitol Records with Jimmy and us. And it was Levon Helm and Russell Smith and Lenny LeBlanc and several other artists that we were going to, Bonnie Bramlett was one of them that was supposed to have been on that. There were several artists that we were going to record. And it was a good, I think could have been a good thing. It was at the wrong time. It was right when disco was starting to be the big thing, and we were cutting more, I guess you'd say, rock acts, and it was just the wrong thing. I think there were some good records. I think the stuff we did with Russell and Lenny and Levon, it was all really good stuff. It just seemed like the wrong time with Capitol. You
mentioned Levon and that album he actually cut 1.5 albums
Right.
down here even, and I know he continued coming down here. Would you mind talking a little bit about him and about maybe you guys' friendship and what he brought to the table?
We were all big fans of he and the band, and by that time the band had broken up, and Levon was wanting to continue working as a solo artist, and he was even talking about not playing drums and just being the guy out front. And we had Duck Dunn for the first album that Levon did. Duck Dunn and some other guys from Memphis were working with Levon and brought him down, and we had a good situation with Levon. We saw we could work with him very well, but Levon didn't want to play drums. He wanted Roger to play, and of course Roger was playing great and doing a good job. But when that situation ended for Levon, then we approached him about being on our label, and he loved the idea of that. And we worked with him on some other things as well. I worked with him on some things that Jim Dickinson produced, where Levon was the drummer, just like a studio player. And those were great experiences. And we did become good friends. Levon would come down and hang with us. And he would, what was kind of crazy to me is he'd drive from Woodstock, New York in a Saab convertible with his drums in the car with him. He'd drive down overnight and come and work and then turn around and drive back. But I think he liked driving.
Yeah. So another, key player we mentioned before, and is one of my favorites, is Eddie Hinton, who's no longer with us either. But he was you guys' lead guitar player in the beginning of Muscle Shoals Sound, but then he also cut what, in my mind, is a classic, although maybe underappreciated, but a very extremely dangerous album.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I see this, talking about this, I see these things happen over and over again where we'll cut a great record and then something will happen with the record company or something, and that is what happened with Very Extremely Dangerous. It was on Capricorn, and as soon as they put it out, then they go out of business. And so he's got this great album that's the favorite of all the musicians, but it doesn't sell anything because the record company's gone out of business. But Eddie was such a fantastically talented guy. He could sing, he could play the guitar, he could write songs, he could produce. We all thought that he was going to be the next Beatle or something. He was such a good player. After, I guess, a couple years, he decided he didn't want to be the studio lead guitar player anymore for us or anybody, and wanted to be an artist in his own right. And that's when we started working with Pete Carr and Wayne Perkins and some other great guitar players. We always missed Eddie, but it was time for him to move on, I think. And we lost Eddie too soon. He got into bad health and had some substance abuse problems and left us way too soon.
Yeah. After Eddie died, you finished, or you added tracks to demos he'd recorded previously with Johnny Sandlin. How did that record come about? Do you remember?
Yeah, there's a Englishman, Peter Thompson, I think, who was a big fan of Eddie's music and a friend of Johnny Sandlin and was a fan of our music. And he wanted to put out a lot of the demos that we had done and that Eddie had done on his own and make them into records. And so he got with Johnny Sandlin, and some of the songs I had to go back in and put a bass part on because they were just vocal and guitar demos, and others he had recorded with some guys over in Decatur. And but he made several really good records after Eddie's death, of Eddie and his songs and his singing and guitar playing. All really good records. And at first I think they just came out in England, but I think they're available around the world now.
Yeah. And Johnny Sandlin is somebody you worked on a lot of sessions for at his studio in Decatur too. How was working with Johnny?
Well, I started Johnny Sandlin. I first met him when I was about 18 years old. The Mark V, which was the band that Jerry Kerrigan, Norbert Putnam, and David Briggs had, they lost whoever was playing guitar, I think Marlon Green was one of the guitar players, but they lost a guitar player, and so they got Johnny Sandlin to come in and play guitar. And I saw him play, and I thought, wow, this guy, he's the loudest guitar player I've ever heard. But he played with them and helped them get their recordings together. But he also was a drummer and a sound engineer, and we started doing sessions with Johnny as a producer and as an engineer. He worked at Fame for a while. He would come to our studio and produce things. He was in Macon producing for Capricorn, and produced some of the early Allman Brothers stuff, and the first Greg Allman solo album, Laid Back. So there was a connection between us, and Johnny, I guess, really picked up in Macon, but then after the Macon thing was over, he moved back to Decatur and was working at Fame and in Decatur. So he became somebody some of my favorite records I've played on. I've played with Johnny producing and engineering. One in particular we did at our second location of Muscle Shoals Sound, 1000 Alabama Avenue, and that's the Dan Penn solo album. Do Right Man, I guess is the title of that. Johnny produced that and recorded that at our studio. But after that, I worked with Johnny in Decatur on Jimmy Hall, Greg Allman, Bonnie Bramlett, all these great artists, and every one of them are things that I was very proud of. Johnny had the best ears as a producer I've seen, and it was a very small studio. When you sat in the studio, you were sitting next to the console with Johnny when he was producing, so it was a little bit different situation as far as you having to wear headphones and everything, but he had great ears. It always sounded so good when you'd hear the end product.
Yeah. Somebody else who was part of that crew was Scott Boyer. Johnny produced him back in the 70s for Capricorn Records when he was in Cowboy. And the two of you were in the Decoys together for many years. Would you mind sharing a little bit about Scott and what kind of Scott meant to you as, I guess, friend and collaborator?
Yeah, Scott and Tommy Talton had been in the group Cowboy, and it was a record when I was doing the Smith Perkins Smith album. That was a favorite of theirs, and we would listen to it and thought, wow, these guys are really good. Later on, I worked with Tommy Talton. Roger and I produced some sides with Tommy Talton. I thought, well, this is half a Cowboy. This guy's great. Then a while after that, Scott shows up with Dan Penn, and they have a group called the Convertibles. And I thought, well, this is a pretty good group here, but they're gone after a little bit. But later, after that, Scott and Kelvin Holly and Butch McDade and Johnny Sandlin on bass became the Decoys. And the reason they call the band the Decoys, Johnny Sandlin's nickname was the Duck. And so they wanted something duck-like in the name, and a decoy is a duck thing that people use when they go hunting. It's a little fake duck. And so they became the Decoys. Well, the Decoys started playing at a bar here in town called Union Station, and I would go hear them play after my sessions here in town, and I thought, wow, this band is great. Of all the bands I've heard around here, this is the first one that I would consider playing with or sitting in. And it just so happened that their bass player, after Johnny Sandlin left the band, they got a guy named Jimmy Clay to be their bass player. And Jimmy got a chance to go on the road with someone, and so he said, why don't you take my place for a couple of weeks with the Decoys? And at that time, I didn't play live very much. I didn't know any of their songs, but I loved the band, so I got a couple work tapes of all their songs, and I made chord charts on every one of their songs, and came in to play at the Union Station one night, and Butch, the drummer, said, "Ha, chord charts, you'll never make it." But when we got through, he said I played it perfectly, and I did, because my chord charts were good. And I spent a little time working on it, but I got it, so I did the 2 weeks, and then later on, when Jimmy Clay left the band, they asked if I would play, and I thought, well, why not? So that started my career with the Decoys. I hadn't really planned on doing that, but a producer engineer from Birmingham, Mark Harrelson, was putting together a show in Birmingham with Dan Penn and Greg Allman and some of the future Decoys, with Johnny Sandlin. And so that was my first live play, and I think since I had played with Traffic, but that and my experience with Scott and the guys got me playing with the Decoys, and I've continued playing with the Decoys until just recently. Scott got into a bad health situation and finally passed away a few months ago, and so things have changed now with the Decoys. We don't really have Scott Boyer, and to me, he was the heart of the Decoys in his singing and selection of songs. The rest of us are still around, and I think we're all secretly hoping that Scott will come back. I don't think that's going to happen, but it was a very good band, very good live band. I think probably my favorite live situation to play was with Scott and Kelvin and N.C. Thurman, and lately Mike Dillon, Curington on drums. Who knows? The Decoys may rise again.
Yeah, we'll find a way to let them rise again, because the Decoys, too many people around here love the Decoys too much for it just to stop like that. But so you got to play regularly with the Decoys, and then suddenly you're back on the road with the Waterboys. How did that come about?
Well, it was about, I guess, 2013, 2014. I had been playing sessions around town, and there were songwriter demos and things. Wasn't very interesting stuff that much, and I was getting a little bored. I was in my early 70s. I got a call from a lady who was producing or she was managing an artist named Mike Scott, and she booked me on a session in Nashville to record with Mike Scott. So they start sending me songs via email, and I would learn the songs. I thought, wow, these are pretty interesting songs, and so I made myself some chord charts on these songs and go to Nashville to the Sound Emporium to record. And when I get there, it's Mike Scott and drummer Ralph Salmons and Paul Brown, who was a keyboard player. And I see, well, this is not just Mike Scott, this is a band. And I said, well, what is this? And they said, this is the Waterboys. And I said, wow, the Waterboys, I've heard of them, but I didn't know that's what I was doing. But it turned out that we'd cut an album at Sound Emporium in Nashville called Modern Blues on the Waterboys. And I really enjoyed playing with them and enjoyed the songs. And they said, I think just on a whim, asked if I'd be interested in playing some live shows with him. And I thought, well, why not? I'm kind of reached a place in my career where I'm not really excited that much about what I'm doing. So I agreed to go out and start playing with him. I didn't realize that when I agreed to do one or two shows, that I was agreeing to do about 2.5 years worth of shows. But as a result of that, I played in 18 countries, some of them many times, all around the world, everywhere, from the Sydney Opera House in Japan to all over the United States, all over Europe, Great Britain, Scandinavia. For some reason, it seemed like they played quite a bit in Norway, Sweden, Spain, Portugal. I'd never been to Spain or Portugal, so I got to go all these places and play with them, and it was a great experience. I didn't really like to travel that much. It was a little too far to travel, because with most of their dates being in Europe, I'd have to go a day ahead of time to get used to the time difference. And so I was spending a lot of time sitting in airports and on airplanes and just waiting in hotels to be able to do this. Had a lot of fun, but finally, I guess it was August 2016, I was in Norway and fell in my hotel room and broke my left wrist. And so I had to quit playing for 3 months. I was unable to play for 3 months. And it was at the end of the tour, so it seemed like a good time just to leave the Waterboys. And it was a friendly me departing the band. They were ready to not spend so much money flying me around the world, and I was ready to stay home. So it was an amicable departure on my part. But we're still friends. I've played on their latest record, and they're out touring with that record now, and I wish them a lot of luck. I'm happy I'm not with them, but I enjoyed my time I spent with them.
Yeah. Around the same time, the Waterboys came knocking. The Muscle Shoals documentary movie came out, and it shone a spotlight on this area again, and I think in many ways reintroduced a lot of people to the legacy of Muscle Shoals. And it's also, I guess, opened other opportunities. You've become somewhat of an ambassador, and your wife, Judy, is very active in promoting the area too. But what do you think was the impact of the documentary?
Oh, it was huge, and it was at about the same time as the Waterboys thing. But I would go from playing to Lincoln Center with the Muscle Shoals guys, and then getting on the plane and going to Scotland to play with the Waterboys. But the impact of the movie was far greater than we ever expected. It did bring focus back to Muscle Shoals and the music recorded here. And I think it helped a lot of people in their career, brought a lot of people back to Muscle Shoals, or people who had never been to Muscle Shoals before, to record, and also enabled us to reopen our original location, 3614 Jackson Highway, as a tourist destination, and as also as a recording studio. And my wife and Rodney Hall and some other people in town were able to get the studio back into the hands of the Muscle Shoals Music Foundation, and so now it's a not-for-profit situation. It's open to the public as a tourist destination, and we're also recording. We're still getting together on the recording. We've done Dan Auerbach recording there. We've recorded with Donnie Fritz on his latest album that is yet to come out. It's an album of Arthur Alexander songs. It's been a great thing for the studio and also for the area in general. It's refocused the attention of people on Muscle Shoals as a place to record. And I think it's helping a lot of the younger players and producers and writers get their feet in the door and get things happening around in the music business. Because you can go anywhere and say, I'm from Muscle Shoals, and that opens doors.
Yeah. So you mentioned the next generation, and Patterson, your son, has been getting more and more successful, and has been successful for a long time with the Drive-By Truckers, and also as a solo artist. Jason Isbell is somebody else that I know you have a close personal connection. What does make you feel to see that the next generation or the next generations keep the music alive?
It makes me feel great to see that, because Barry has passed away. Roger and Jimmy are no longer active in the music business. I'm the only one of the original Swampers who's still active. I hate to see it all end when we stop being active. Patterson started the Drive-By Truckers with Mike Cooley. They've been very popular. Jason became a member of the Truckers and then left to take a solo career. He is tremendously successful. Now Patterson's solo career is taken off. He's doing shows almost as big as the Truckers shows. Patterson was one of the people who helped Brittany Howard and the Alabama Shakes get started. when they played here for free at Pegasus Records, and I babysat Pat's kid so he could go see them, and he came back raving about this band, about Brittany and the rest of them. Well, now they're a world-class artist. Ben Tanner, their keyboard player, is a producer, and he and John Paul White of the Civil Wars have gotten together and started Single Lot Records, and so they're producing young artists as well as Donnie Fritz. It's just things are really happening, I think, for the younger people as well as the old guys. Since that documentary came out, everybody's working more, I think, and I think it's opened the doors for Single Lot and other ventures to start, including Crazy Chester. He's recording here with Andreas is recording with Carla Russell and some other artists, and so he's part of the new Muscle Shoals revival too, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's certainly been just a wonderful thing to be able to work with you guys, because you were just the kings of my record collection, and now I actually get to work with you and Jimmy and Clayton, and that's been real special. I mean, besides it being just the most badass rhythm section in the world. But we're almost at the end here, but there's one thing I would like to ask you about, and that's you and Roger are one of the, well, all the four of you, but especially when it comes down to like the core of the rhythm section, Roger and you are one of the quintessential rhythm sections in an American music. What do you think made the two of you together so good?
I think Roger is just a brilliant drummer. He had such a natural ability, and also not only physical ability but mental ability to play and learn songs, and it was great for me because I had somebody to partner with as a bass player. It's hard to sound bad when you're playing with Roger. I think I was eager on my side. I was still learning when I started working with Roger, and I was eager to be able to stand with Roger and be a rhythm section and not just another bass player to play with Roger. And of course, Barry and Jimmy are brilliant in what they brought to the rhythm section. I don't know. I think that Roger and I just were friends, our friends. And we had a connection. We had fun together when we weren't playing, and we had similar interests. We liked cars and guns and women and all kinds of stuff. And so we were just I don't know. I can't say what would make it magic other than we loved working with each other, and I really miss him now. I'm fortunate to get to play with other drummers, but there will never be another Roger Hawkins, I don't think.
Yeah, and that was kind of my follow-up question, is when you used to such a rock next to you, and then that's not necessarily there anymore, are you just trying to play the same part with whoever drummer you play with, or do you feel you have to adapt?
I think I've had to adapt, but I've also been fortunate to play with some other good drummers, Brian Owens, Owen Hale, Milton Sledge. I've gotten to play with a lot of good drummers, also Steve Jordan and a few others. But I playing with and Mike Dillon with the Decoys. But I think I do adapt to whatever drummer I'm working with, and if it's a good drummer, then I'm going to sound good too. And I'm fortunate to get to play with a lot of good drummers, and that's all I know.
Yeah, and it's funny how you said, playing with such a good drummer as Roger, that it kind of, I'm not necessarily saying it makes your job easy, but it's probably easier to shine when you can count on that. And I had Liam Williams, the drummer I work with a lot, on the podcast, and I kind of asked him the same questions. Like, what is it with David? And he kind of feels the same about you when he plays with you. It's like, he said, it's almost like my job has never been as easy as playing with David Hoop, because he's just there where he needs to be. And
yeah, Lynn is a great drummer. I love getting to work with Lynn, and he is absolutely at the top of my list of guys to play with. He too, he's probably one of the easier drummers to work with. He strikes a great groove for one thing, but you know he's going to be there. You don't wonder what he's going to do. He's very solid, and you know he's going to be there. He's one of my favorites.
yeah, and you mentioned that you just did some sessions with Dan Auerbach of the Black Keys. You work with Sheryl Crow. You're still very much active and youthful. I'm just, you're an inspiration to all of us. You're still going at this amazing pace. You might not feel the same, but that's what it appears to us.
Well, I love doing it. I mean, I think that's the key. If you love what you're doing, why stop? I mean, I'm gonna keep doing this just as long as I'm physically able, and I hope that's going to be a long time, because it's still fun to me. I still get excited on a recording session, and I love to make great music, and I can't wait to hear the playback and see what's happening on what we're doing. That's where I got my thrill the first time, and that's still where I get my thrill, is to go into the control room and hear what we've recorded, and if it's not right, make it right. That's the fun to me in doing all this.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for spending the last hour with me and sharing all your wonderful stories. I really appreciate your time and your friendship, and I wish you just the best of luck, health, and a long bass playing future.
Yeah, me too. Well, thanks, Andreas. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, David. This was the 30th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. We taped it at the NuttHouse recording studio in Sheffield, Alabama. If you enjoyed today's episode, please check out some of our previous episodes, including interviews with Donnie Fritz, Mickey Buckins, Dickie Lee, Billy Swan, Buzz Kaysen, and many others. If you'd like to find out more about Crazy Chester Records or the Crazy Chester Radio Hour, please check out our website at crazychesterrecords.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time.